and welcome to Financial Minds Meet the Experts. I'm your host, Jaime Agostino. As you know, on this podcast, we're joined by financial industry experts to talk about topics, trends, and themes that credit union professionals need to know about. Today, we're welcoming back Mike Bechtel, Information Security Engineer for Vizo Financial. Mike, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me, Jaime.
So it sounds like it's been a little busy. So over the past few months, we've seen a few national headlines around cyber attacks and other issues. So I wanted to get a better understanding of these events. So back in June, there was an alleged cyber attack on the Federal Reserve, which ended up actually being on Evolve Bank and Trust. Explain to me what happened.
So end of May, early June, there are multiple ransomware groups that function across the U.S. Some of them are private groups, some of them are funded by nation states. In this instance, one funded by a nation state goes by the name of Lockbit. They keep something akin to a hit list out on their website, and the list is, here are the people that we've breached. And lo and behold, one morning, the Federal Reserve Bank showed up. The U.S. Federal Reserve Bank showed up on that list. It was followed by, typically when this sort of thing happens, Lockbit will then, or any other ransomware group, will then come up with, here's some sort of validation. Here's some proof. Here's something we can use to convince you this has really happened, not just we're saying it happened. The closest anyone got to seeing anything along those lines, Lockbit had posted that they had, I believe it was 33 terabytes of information they had taken, that they had been contacted by a representative of the Federal Reserve offering a ransom of $50,000, and that the back and forth between them, the negotiations, I guess, for the ransom had gone poorly, and Lockbit was not happy with the way things had gone, and that they were giving the Federal Reserve a few days to respond to the situation before things escalate.
Okay.
When this had occurred, surprisingly, there were very few major news organizations, whether they be major U.S. news organizations, national news organizations, or even within the information security industry or the tech industry. A lot of the main pages we would go to on the web to look for information, not many of them were carrying this story. There were a few second tier or third tier places they were carrying the story, but all of them were repeating the same information, and there was very little of it to begin with. Okay. No validation was given, no account numbers, no names, no nothing, just that it was a huge pile of personally identifiable information had been taken, and Lockbit wanted some money out of the federal government for it. At the same time, surprisingly, the Federal Reserve was mum on the word. They were saying absolutely nothing. I spent an awful lot of time during the 72 hours that followed that announcement, kind of watching the internet. I was very deep in the conversations that were going on inside of FSISAC. A lot of financial institutions were discussing that they had seen the news, but everyone was kind of in the same boat. This is terrifying if this is real, but no one's claiming, no one's showing proof of concept. On the other side, the Federal Reserve, in day one, hadn't even had time to verify whether this was real or not. Any company receiving a notification that you've been breached, okay, I'm going to have to take a couple minutes to go off and verify that this has really happened. Like if I find a hole in the wall, sure, yeah, you got in. Day one goes by, lots of people in FSISAC talking about it, but we don't have anything to talk about. There's no real new information to move with. Like I said, the next 48 to 72 hours kind of unfolded. More and more news organizations were beginning to carry the story. Even some top tier news organizations started talking about it. But the story had more become that the silence the Federal Reserve was giving was becoming more telling. That if they're not talking, then there's nothing to talk about. There were a couple of individuals that I had read had posted information inside FSISAC that the federal government's not going to admit to something happening. They're not going to talk about it. They're not going to give it any airtime or oxygen at all if it's not real. That even them just discussing the fact that it was bogus could give it more life. So somewhere in the 72 hours, 4 or 5 days out, once we get into that time frame, then the rest of the details start to drop. A lot of people started pushing back against Lockbit to say, well, hey, if you really did this, you own up or take off because you're just talking at this point. You're not proving you've done anything. And then the other shoe kind of dropped that it wasn't the Federal Reserve Bank, but it was this Evolve Bank and Trust that they had gotten into. And even at that point, Evolve wasn't aware at the time when the notifications for the Federal Reserve Bank had come out. They weren't even aware that they had been the target.
Wow.
I saw lots of different conflicting stories that somehow the Federal Reserve Bank was doing something with Evolve at the time. I can't get any good corroborating sources for me to say one way or the other what it was. But basically, Evolve was who they had gotten into. What was it, 6.7 million user records had been stolen, 33 terabytes of data, an absurd sum of information. Evolve was offline for a period of time. I believe they are back up and running now, but in a very diminished capacity. There have been no announcements about any ransom payments having been made, whether they were able to get any of the data back. My assumption at this point is that whatever data Lockbit got, they're trying to sell it on the dark web in order to make money off of it, because it doesn't look like they're getting any money out of Evolve.
Hmm. A little scary.
Just a little bit. I mean, I feel bad for Evolve, but it was going to be a really bad day for a lot of us if it was the Federal Reserve Bank.
That is true. That is true. So how can credit unions then protect themselves from this type of attack and protect themselves from being the next Evolve Bank and Trust?
Yeah. There's a lot of different places that you can go with this. If you have a cybersecurity program, continue to mature your cybersecurity program. If you have, good training in place, great. Now build on that training. Start looking at new topics, new ideas. If you've got some technology that's in place, good. Make sure that technology stays current. Make sure that even if we start looking at fundamentals, like, keep your firewalls up to date, keep your web filtering up to date, keep your staff training up to date.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a very big advocate of security awareness training. A lot of these problems that we will see with very large companies, multi-million or multi-billion dollar companies that end up in the news, it's not because their firewall failed. It's because the person who sits in the chair failed. Human error is it's a part of the equation you cannot get rid of, but you can train human error. You can train your staff to a point where human error becomes a smaller and smaller part of the equation. Bear in mind things like the frequency with which you're training. You don't have to spend hours a day every day. Like, that's operationally untenable. But a little bit of information here, a little bit of information there goes a very long way, because you need to keep this stuff fresh in their heads. The further away you get from a moment like Evolve Bank happening, the less of an idea it is that, this is real. We should really be careful moving into this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to your vendors. Talk to the folks that you're already doing business with, whether it's your core, your corporate, those that are providing the technology that you're using. Hey, what other services do you have? What other tools can I put in my toolkit to build better layers of defense around my staff? No one single layer is foolproof. If it was, we'd all use it. The idea you want to shoot for is look for, if you haven't already done this, look for some sort of a cybersecurity framework. Look for something, and if you want something really deep into the weeds, look for something like NIST. If you want to start at a lower level to kind of get, ramped up a little bit, look for CIS's critical security controls. It's a map, a guide, if you will, to kind of say, if I don't have a program like this, or I'm not sure my program's where it needs to be, how do I check this? To some degree, your auditors and your regulators, when you're visiting, they'll give you a good idea of where your weaknesses are. But in between those trips, take something like CIS critical security controls and say, okay, here's control one. I think control one is hardware inventory, or it's software inventory. 1 and 2 are hardware and software inventories. Basically, I can't secure something if I don't know what I have. So you begin by, let's get an inventory. Do we use a tool that crawls the network and finds everything? Do we just dispatch a couple of people from the help desk to start, here's a monitor, there's a tower, one way or the other, come up with an inventory. Then once you know what you're working with, how current is the inventory? Am I patched up to date on all of these things? Do I have done a vulnerability scan? Do I know where my holes are? Start patching the holes. I talk about this in some of my presentations. It's not a light switch on the wall. There's no magic spell. If we had it, we'd have cast it on you already. It's a trip. It's a long, arduous trip to go down. but you have to start with the first step. And once you've made it, it's every little bit along the way. It's, you know, you're not going to do this and tomorrow you're ready. It's going to take a little bit, but every step you make makes it that much better for you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a journey.
It absolutely is.
Well, if June wasn't enough, then we had July.
Do we have to go through July again?
So in July, we had the global CrowdStrike issue that impacted a lot of industries. Can you tell me more about what happened and why it impacted so many organizations globally?
That was a bad day. That was nightmare fuel. So I don't want to throw CrowdStrike under the bus. They are a very good company with a very good product, and like I said a moment ago, you cannot get rid of human error. You can make a very small amount, but they had a human error moment. So CrowdStrike works on a larger level. It's not just a single tool that you're putting in. It's a whole tool chest that you're putting in. It monitors all of your operating systems. There is a Linux version of it, I believe, but the bigger issue that occurred was through the Windows systems. They look at the Windows operating systems at a kernel level, all the way down into the soft, gooey underbelly of the operating system to keep an eye on everything that's happening to make sure that, you know, bad actors have a harder time getting into the systems. And from what I've read, there was an update made to how CrowdStrike identified problems. So you can identify in one of two ways. You can say, here is a laundry list of items that you can look for, what's called definition-based scanning. And it's a great start, but it's not where you want to be. You want to head to the next one. The next tier of the equation is more behavior-based. Behavior-based gives you a broader spectrum of things to look for. Instead of it being an if-then statement, if you see X, then do Y, it's more look for things that sort of behave like this and sort of behave like it gives you you can identify the problem earlier in the time frame. You don't have to wait for someone to report the problem, your program to update its definitions, and then all of a sudden you can protect yourself. Mm-hmm. In one of these updates, CrowdStrike had inadvertently asked its application to identify behavior that was typical for Windows operating systems of the time. So in that moment, as the updates occurred, and when I say an update, it's not, I don't have to go out and press a button to get the update to happen. CrowdStrike's tools update themselves automatically because you want the latest and greatest at every second as fast as you can get it to keep ahead of the bad guys. Totally makes sense. But in this moment, as that update was released and all of their clients and all of their agents started to update themselves, they all destroyed themselves because they saw something in the Windows kernel that they went, yeah, no, that's bad. I need to shut that off immediately. And the screen would go blue. You'd see that, you know, that atypical blue screen of death that the tech people all talk about. And computers began shooting themselves in the foot every second of every hour of all day I want to say it was a good 12 hours of time. Yeah. Now, to CrowdStrike's credit, they identified this problem quite early and started rolling out a solution that would then get rid of the problem that was occurring. Now, from the moment they issued the revision, no new victims occurred. The downside was that the litany of victims that they already had, simply applying that fix didn't unwind all the damage. The PC was already a corpse, and there was no way to resolve it without sending someone to the machine and having them do a lot of heavy lifting in order to get it to function again. Yeah. So that's kind of a picture of what went wrong. The scale of the problem is it speaks to the quality of the product that CrowdStrike makes. There are a lot of industry-leading companies and just industries as a whole that use them as the benchmark. Like they look at it as this is the Rolls-Royce solution. If you've got the money to spend on it and you buy something else, you've chosen incorrectly. So hospitals, financial institutions, education centers, airports, I mean, the airline industry as a whole, like all of them had been kneecapped that morning, and none of them knew why. I mean, all of them were like, this is impossible. There's no way we're suffering an attack because we've got all these layers of defense in place. And if nothing else, we've got CrowdStrike monitoring every blessed thing that goes on. How could we possibly be going down? Oh, it's because CrowdStrike made a mistake. That's the reason. Like it was it was the attack did not come from outside the castle. It came from inside the castle.
Wow. So this might be a loaded question then, like, is there anything credit unions, can do to help mitigate situations like this moving
Oh,
forward?
I knew this was coming. This is a hard one. I mean, yeah, if you were not a company that was using CrowdStrike, you were okay. But you can't necessarily tell someone don't use this application because they had a problem once. We wouldn't use any applications because every one of them has a problem at some point. Nothing's perfect. This is less of a situation to how do I predict when one of my vendors is going to have a problem that could take me offline, and more, this is a time to revisit business continuity, disaster recovery, your planning and preparedness. I can't sit here and say that, well, I'm sure somebody had this in their disaster recovery manual. Okay, yes, it's possible, but I don't think it's probable. This is more of a time where we need to say, when you're sitting around and you're working on your BCP manual, and I hope that all of you are working on them, that did not should, I've said this in presentations before, it should not be some dusty tome that's been tucked away in a corner somewhere that when you ask, when the whole teller line goes down and someone says, quick, where's the disaster recovery manual? Everyone goes, the what? Yeah, no. We should be visiting it regularly. I mean, optimistically, I'd like to think that we're visiting this book once a year to kind of say, what's in it? Is it still valid? Is it current? What updates can we make to it? A situation like CrowdStrike is an opportunity for those of us who both had the problem and didn't have the problem to learn from. What do I put in my disaster recovery manual, or what do I put in my business continuity preparedness book to say, if this or something akin to this would ever happen to me, how would I recover from it? Not yes, I would dispatch a bunch of people from IT and they would rebuild the systems. That's the easier answer to give. The harder one is in the moment when all of your office staff are staring at their computers. They can't answer the phones because the phones are likely IP driven and they generate dial tone across the internet. Nobody can access the internet because all the computers are down. You can't access your core because everything's down. You can't talk to your membership because you don't have access to your. How are you doing day-to-day operations? A simple Mrs. Jones walks in the door and says, "Hey, I did good at bingo last night. I'd like to put a couple of bucks in my account." How are you doing that? Like, that's the questions you need to ask. Maybe it's even I've been in banking for a couple of minutes. I have the gray hair to prove it. We used to have offline procedures for things. In that tragic events, the computers would go down. Nobody anticipated them going down, but there was always some sort of an issue. The building lost power, or somebody hit a pole out front, and we lost the internet connection. So you had a half hour or so where you were, punching pieces of paper with a teller stamp to prove everything happened. But you need to have conversations like that before CrowdStrike happens. You don't want to be like, I don't want any CEO at any credit union to pull together his or her senior staff and go, all right, now what? That's not the moment to brainstorm. Today, when you have no issues on the plate like this, is the day to brainstorm. And I'm not saying you have to say, what if we had CrowdStrike and what if it all went wrong? No. Just if we had a situation where we couldn't get to the computers for any reason, what's the recovery plan? What does that look like? What steps do we need to have in place before that happens so that, goodness forbid it does, you're better prepared for it in the moment? Because I'll be honest, no one saw this coming. No one who used the platform anticipated that. If they did, we wouldn't have seen the global impact that we did. But now that it's occurred, it's time for everyone who has a system that has a really deep look into your operating systems, has carte blanche to make changes, the changes that we anticipate, but to defend us, not to hurt us, and systems that update automatically without us having to do anything to keep us as current as possible. Those things that were always seen as benefits, now we see them as a potential risk. We need to reevaluate them, but have those conversations with your senior staff. Discuss what you would do. And I'm not going to say any idea is a bad idea, but get those ideas out now, hash them out, and come to some conclusion.
All right. Well, sadly, cyber attacks, most likely they're occurring every day.
Oh, yeah.
So
What keeps
bad,
me employed?
yeah, bad actors, they're continuing their attempts to like infiltrate financial institutions,
Mhm.
including credit unions. I want to make sure we're
Oh,
clear.
yeah.
It's not just the banks; it's credit unions too. So, can you share some best practices to maybe help reduce these threats to the credit union?
Hmm. How do you, that's a broad, got some good ones today, Jamie.
Well, I mean, you
Um,
did say staff training, so obviously I'm thinking that's, one layer
yeah,
and then all your systems, but I'm sure you have a.
people are going to get in your network two ways. There's either going to be a vulnerability in the hardware or software that you use, or people are going to get in because your staff is vulnerable. Somebody has to open the door. So, best practices, vulnerability scanning, regular. I don't mean once a week. I'm sorry, I don't mean once a year. I wouldn't even say once a quarter. You should be doing vulnerability scans once a month. What's on my network? And I don't mean just, and there's multiple ways to do a vulnerability scan. You can just do a high level scan that identifies the objects that are out there and gives you some rudimetric issues. You need to be doing authenticated vulnerability scans. And by authenticated, I mean you're giving the scanner credentials to log into the machine and really get down into the weeds. You want to know what patches are missing, what holes are there, what hardware problems might I be looking at. If you don't know there's a problem, you can't fix it. Then once you've had that scan, give that list of problems to your managed service provider, your IT team. Go fix these. And don't come back to me in 6 months with a fix. I need them fixed quickly. Because once a bad actor finds that hole, they're not going to wait 6 months to try to come into it. They're going to use it right then and there. Then a month later, another scan. How many of those problems went away? How many new problems showed up? Yes, it is a never-ending game of whack-a-mole, but it is a necessary game of whack-a-mole. Vulnerability scans or authenticated vulnerability scans, um, remediation once you see it. And that remediation could just be here's a patch, or that remediation could be, oh, I've got an operating system. Let's say I'm still running a Windows 7 machine, or God forbid, a Windows XP machine. Those things died a long time ago. You need to stop using them. Microsoft isn't supporting them anymore. Any holes or problems they've got, no one's ever going to fix them. Um, but again, knowing that you've got the problem, then you can solve it. Have a good patching cadence, meaning that you have some way, or your IT team has some way with which they're rolling out regular patches to the operating systems that you're using and the programs that you're using. So let's say you've got Adobe Reader installed on one of your machines so that the folks in accounting can read the invoices they get. Brilliant. Who's updating Adobe Reader? When was the last time it was updated? Whatever process you go through to patch your machines, you should also be patching these other systems. Any of the hardware or firmware that you're using to protect your network, your intrusion prevention systems, your firewalls, your web filters, they get updates too. You should regularly be doing those because as more threats become available in the ecosystem, the vendors who are creating these systems will create counters to stop them. You don't get those without running all of those updates. Talking about firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, and such, there's never anything wrong with monitoring the systems that you have and to some degree monitoring the staff that you have. They are using your systems, the credit union's systems. They belong to the credit union, the members who are running them. They don't belong to the staff members. So things like, I don't want you surfing the web in the middle of the afternoon, whether you're on lunch or not. Do that on your own computer, not on the computers here at the credit union. So putting technical restrictions in place to keep them from getting some places, there's nothing wrong with that. It better protects your staff because they can't inadvertently make a mistake. I'm not going to go out and say that all of them are intentionally trying to do it, but people who are my foil, people who are the bad actors trying to create the problems, they're really good at what they do. So they only have to be right once. We have to be right all the time. The less opportunity for your person to make an inadvertent mistake, the safer everyone's going to be. Lean into your auditors and your regulators. Yes, nobody likes seeing them show up at the door because it's going to be a bad couple of days, but They're there to do a job. Their job to you, your credit union, your policies, your procedures, and how you do things is the same as a vulnerability scanner. Let them do their job. They're there to find weaknesses. Once they've identified them, great. Ask them, how do I fix this? How do I solve this? If they're not willing to come to you with a solution, there's nothing wrong with that. They're not required to do so. But you might get a good regulator, a good auditor who will tell you, yeah, there are vendors out there that will solve this problem. There's ways to get around this. Talk to your IT team. Talk to your managed service provider. Heck, call the corporate. I can guarantee you anything you're going to run into, we've either hit it already at the corporate or some other member has and has asked us about it. There's a wealth of knowledge here that we can throw at you to help you solve these problems. But it takes a bit of a mind shift to embrace the problems that occur because, again, you can't fix something you don't know is broken. So yes, you're going to find all sorts of problems. You have to report all of this to your board. That's part of the process. But then they can then hold the credit union accountable to fix them because at the end, it's all about keeping it all safe. So vulnerability scanning, patching cadences, talk to your auditors and regulators, call the corporate occasionally. We might have a good idea for you or two.
Okay. All right. Well, Mike, as always, thank you so much for joining me. Any final thoughts for our listeners today?
It's a rough world out there. Don't go it alone. Ask for help.
All right. Well, thank you again. This episode of Financial Minds Meet the Experts is brought to you by DefenseStorm. Vizo Financial has teamed up with DefenseStorm, a financial institution cybersecurity solutions provider, to help credit unions build defensive strategies and enforce them through a twofold security and fraud services. These services offer features like real-time alerts when fraud risks are identified, a comparative analysis of online financial risk, dark web intelligence and additional threat resources, and 24/7 access to support personnel who will act as an extension of your internal security team. Learn all about DefenseStorm and how this solution can benefit your credit union. Simply visit the additional services page on Vizo Financial's website at www.vfccu.org. As always, thanks for listening and make it a great day.